The door closed behind her with the specific sound of institutional finality. Not a slam. Something worse than a slam. The measured, mechanical click of a lock engaging in a building designed to hold people who have run out of options, operated by someone who considers the click routine and has not thought about what it sounds like from the inside for a very long time, if ever. The cell at Fort Carson's correctional facility was 8 feet by 10 feet. Concrete floor, concrete walls, a cot bolted to the wall at a height that suggested function without comfort. A single overhead light behind a steel mesh cover that gave the room the quality of something preserved rather than illuminated. The window was 4 inches wide and looked at a concrete wall 4 feet away. She stood in the center of the cell for a moment after the door closed. She did not look at the door. She did not look at the window. She looked at the concrete wall across from her with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who has been in smaller rooms than this with worse things in them, and who is running the current situation through the same internal framework she has used for every other situation, and finding it, on balance, manageable. She sat on the cot. She set her hands on her knees. She breathed. Outside the cell, in the corridor, Captain Louis Firth was already moving toward the administrative office with the satisfied posture of a man who has resolved something that was bothering him. He was the commanding officer of the garrison detention facility, a position he occupied with the specific investment of someone whose authority is locally absolute and who has not recently encountered a reason to question it. He had put her in the cell 40 minutes ago after she was delivered to the facility by 2 MPs who had found her on the base perimeter at 0340 hours without identification, without an explained reason for her presence, and without any response to their questions beyond her name, which she had given once, clearly, and not repeated. She had given no rank, no unit, no explanation. Firth had processed this as insubordination compounded by trespass and had acted accordingly. He had not yet made any calls. He had not yet looked at anything beyond the MP report. He had not yet understood what he had done. 3 hours later, a phone on the desk of a 2-star general at the Pentagon rang at 0640 hours, Eastern Time, and the 2-star general picked it up and listened for 90 seconds and said 4 words. "I'll handle it personally," and hung up. And the 2-star general's aide, watching from across the room, had never in 4 years seen that particular combination of expression and speed from a 2-star general, and made a private note that whatever had happened at Fort Carson was not a thing that was going to resolve quietly. The aide was correct. Before we go any further, if this story already has something tightening in your chest, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very last word. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let us go back to where this began. Her name was Major Zara Osei, though that name, her real name, her legal name, the name on the birth certificate filed in a county records office in Georgia 36 years ago, appeared in exactly one active military database, and that database required a clearance level that Captain Louis Firth did not possess and would not have been granted if he had applied for it, because people with that clearance level do not work in garrison detention facilities at mid-tier Army posts. And the architecture of that gap was not an accident. The name she had given the MPS, clearly once without elaboration, was the name she was authorized to give in the event of exactly this kind of situation. It was not a false name. It was a limited name, a name that existed in a specific system designed to be found by the right people and to appear as nothing to everyone else. She had given it without explanation because explanation was not her protocol. Protocol was protocol. She had followed it for 11 years, and she was not going to stop following it because a garrison detention officer found the silence inconvenient. She was 36 years old. She was 5'5", 128 pounds, in the civilian clothes she had been wearing on the perimeter, Dark jacket, dark trousers, plain boots, nothing that identified her, nothing that reflected light. She had been on the perimeter at 0340 hours because she had been on an authorized reconnaissance of the base's eastern approach corridor, which was part of a classified vulnerability assessment she had been conducting for the past 6 days. Under orders she carried in a format that the MPs, finding her without conventional identification, had not known to look for, and she had not volunteered, because volunteering it was not protocol, and protocol existed for reasons that did not disappear because a situation was uncomfortable. There was a scar along her collarbone, visible above the neckline of her jacket, long, lateral, the specific track of a wire that had been pulled taut across the body at speed in a dark environment. An old scar, well healed. The kind a body accumulates when it has spent years in places where the dark is operational rather than merely the absence of light. The MPs had noted it in their report as a distinguishing mark and had not thought further about what it distinguished. Captain Firth had not thought further either. To understand what the stockade at Fort Carson held that morning without knowing what it held, you have to understand where Zara Osai had been for the 12 years before the MP vehicle found her on the perimeter road. She grew up in Augusta, Georgia, the second of 3 daughters, in a house where the television was always off by 9 and the expectations were always on. Her mother, a high school mathematics teacher named Constance Osei, had raised her children with the specific and unapologetic conviction that the distance between where you are and where you are capable of being is always shorter than the world will tell you it is, and that the world's assessment of that distance is not your problem unless you choose to make it your problem. Zara had chosen, early and definitively, not to make it her problem. She had an aptitude for spatial reasoning and pattern recognition that her middle school science teacher had flagged in a note to her mother as exceptional, and which her mother had received, filed, and responded to by increasing Zara's mathematics workload, which was Constance Osei's version of encouragement and which Zara had understood correctly. By 14, she was solving problems in 3 dimensions that the school's curriculum did not address until 2 grades later. By 17, she had taught herself the fundamentals of ballistic physics from a textbook she had found in a used bookstore and read 3 times. She had not been able to explain at the time why ballistics interested her. She had understood later that it was the same thing that made mathematics satisfying. The fundamental honesty of a system where the answer is always true if the inputs are correct, and the work is always in getting the inputs right. She enlisted at 19. She was assessed for Special Operations Intelligence at 22, which was the formal category in which the work she would actually do existed on paper, because the work she would actually do did not have a formal category that was available to the assessment process. And this was the closest available approximation. The approximation was imprecise. The work she would actually do was considerably more specific and considerably less administrative than the category implied. Her mentor was a figure she refers to by call sign only, Wren, a woman who had been operating in the program for 17 years and whose actual name does not appear in this account because it does not appear in any account that Zara has given, and she has been asked more than once. Wren had found Zara at the end of her first operational year and had said, without greeting or preamble, in a room in a building that does not have a public address, "You have a particular skill. It is going to be used in a way that means nobody can know you have it. This is the arrangement. Consider it." Zara had considered it for the length of time it took her to understand that she had already made the decision before Wren finished the sentence. She had said yes. Wren had said, "Good. Then forget this conversation." Wren had retired from the program 2 years ago. Her retirement had been as invisible as everything else she had ever done. Zara thought about her in the particular way you think about someone whose influence is so embedded in how you work that separating it from your own judgment has become impossible. In the 12 years between that conversation and the cell at Fort Carson, Zara Osei had operated under 11 different call signs in 9 countries across 6 classified theaters. She had conducted precision long-range engagements in conditions that the program's assessment framework did not have adequate benchmarks for, because the conditions existed at a level the framework had not been built to describe. She had a confirmed operational record that lived in one system behind one access tier, and which, if read by someone with the clearance to read it, would take that person a significant amount of time to process, because some of the numbers in it occupy a category that the reader's training has established as the outer boundary of the possible, and the record places decisively on the other side of that boundary. She was, in the operational vocabulary of the people who knew she existed, a ghost. Not metaphorically. The designation was administrative. Her personnel architecture was built to make her unfindable in any standard system, to make her name produce no results in any database below the access tier, to make a garrison detention officer who looked up her name find exactly nothing, because nothing was the correct answer from the perspective of every system he was authorized to use. Firth had found nothing. He had interpreted nothing as a confirmation of his initial assessment, rather than as information about the limits of the systems he was using, which was the interpretation of a man who has not yet been required to understand the difference. At 0740 hours, 3 hours, and 21 minutes after the cell door closed, Firth's office phone rang. He answered it on the second ring. He identified himself by name and rank. The voice on the other end of the line identified itself by rank only. 2 stars. And Firth stood up from his chair, which he did not decide to do, and did not notice he had done until he was already standing. The 2-star general spoke for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Firth said nothing during those 2 minutes and 14 seconds except, "Yes, sir," once, when the general paused at a point that indicated a response was expected. The general did not pause again. When the call ended, Firth stood behind his desk for a moment with the phone in his hand. He set it down. He picked up the cell block key. He walked to the corridor himself rather than sending a duty officer, which was not standard procedure and which he did without calculating whether it was standard, because some situations produce their own protocol. He unlocked the cell. She was sitting on the cot in the same position he had last seen her, hands on knees, back straight, eyes forward. She looked at him when the door opened with the same expression she had worn when it closed. Nothing in it had changed. Nothing in the room suggested that 3 hours and 21 minutes of institutional confinement had produced any particular effect on the person who had experienced it. Firth said, "Major Osei," using her rank for the first time. His voice had a quality it had not carried during the intake process, the quality of a man who has recently received information that has substantially reorganized his understanding of his current situation and has not yet finished reorganizing it. She stood up. She said, "Captain," he said, "There has been." He stopped. He was a man whose professional language was the language of authority and procedure, and neither of those things was adequate to the current moment, and he was discovering this in real time. The general indicated that your documentation was in a format our intake process was not equipped to recognize. She looked at him with the steady, patient expression of someone who has spent a long time watching rooms arrive at conclusions she reached before they sat down. "Yes," she said. He said, "I was not aware of what the assessment indicated you were." He stopped again. "I know," she said. She walked out of the cell. She walked down the corridor. She walked through the administrative area where 2 duty officers had stopped what they were doing and were looking at her with the expressions of people who have been briefed, minimally, that something significant is happening and who are trying to calculate from the available evidence what it is. She walked through the front entrance of the facility and into the morning, which was cold and clear and indifferent to what had occurred inside. Waiting in the parking area was a vehicle, military, unmarked, engine running, and beside it a figure in plain clothes who, Firth, watching from the entrance, did not recognize and did not approach. The figure said something to her as she reached the vehicle. She responded. Firth could not hear the exchange. He watched her get into the vehicle. He watched the vehicle leave the parking area. He stood in the entrance of his facility for a moment in the cold morning air. Then he went back inside and sat at his desk and looked at the MP report from 0340 hours and the intake log and the cell assignment form and the total and complete administrative record of a decision he had made with the information available to him, which had been the wrong information because it was the only information his systems could produce, which was not a defense, but was the truth. He picked up the phone. He called the Garrison legal office. He said, "I need someone to walk me through a process review." He did not know all of what he was reviewing yet. He knew enough. The vehicle took her to a building 23 miles from Fort Carson that is not identified by signage and does not appear in the publicly available satellite imagery of the area, because the imagery of that area has been managed for reasons that do not require explanation to anyone outside the relevant clearance tier. Inside the building, in a room that smelled of coffee and electronics, and the particular quality of recycled air in a space that does not open its windows. A man she knew by call sign only, Archer, was sitting at a table with 2 cups of coffee and a thin stack of papers. She sat down. She picked up one of the cups. He said, "How was the cell?" She said, 8 by 10, overhead light behind mesh. He said, "Sleep?" She said, "Some." He pushed the papers across the table. "Debrief can wait an hour if you need." She pulled the papers toward her. She looked at the first page. She said, "It can wait 10 minutes." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "The Fort Carson situation will be reviewed at the garrison level. You won't be asked to participate." She said, "I know." He said, "The assessment documentation is being updated to include a secondary recognition protocol for future intake situations." She said, "Good." He picked up his coffee. He said, "You want to talk about it?" She looked at him over the papers. She said, "Which part?" He said, "Any of it." She thought about it for a moment. She said, "The cot was bolted too low." He said, "I'll note that." She went back to the papers. He drank his coffee. Outside the building, the morning continued its own business. Cold and clear and carrying no particular concern for the cell at Fort Carson, or the woman who had spent 3 hours in it, or the record that existed in one database behind one access tier, and which described in numbers that took time to accept. What the cell and the garrison and the facility and Captain Lewis Firth had held without knowing what they were holding. The debrief began 9 minutes later. She ran through it in order. The reconnaissance, the approach, the perimeter corridor, the MP contact, the intake, the cell, the release. With the flat, sequential precision of someone delivering an after-action account of a mission in which nothing significantly unexpected had occurred. Because by the framework she had been using for 12 years, nothing significantly unexpected had occurred. She had been in smaller rooms than that cell. She had been in darker ones. She had been in ones where the lock was not institutional, and the person who held the key was not a garrison officer following a procedure, but an actor following an intent. And those rooms had resolved differently, and she had resolved them differently. And this room had simply required patience, which was the most manageable of all the things rooms had ever required from her. The debrief lasted 40 minutes. The documentation was completed. The assessment was filed in the one system where it existed and would continue to exist and would not appear in any other. Captain Lewis Firth's facility review produced 3 procedural changes, all of which were adopted within the garrison and one of which was submitted to the broader military corrections framework as a recommended update to intake protocols for individuals presenting without standard identification. The submission did not name the incident that had produced it. It described the gap it was designed to close in the neutral, systemic language of policy documentation, which is the language that institutional change speaks when it is trying to be heard. Firth completed his posting at Fort Carson 8 months later and transferred to a training and doctrine position that he had requested before the incident and which was approved after it without reference to it. He was, by the assessments available to his commanders, a competent officer who had made a decision with the information available to him. This was accurate. It was also incomplete. But the complete version was not available to his commanders, which was the point of the architecture. Zara Osei's next deployment began 14 days after she left the Fort Carson parking area. It took her to a country she is not at liberty to name, in conditions that she is not at liberty to describe, to perform work that will not appear in any account available to the public for a minimum of 25 years and possibly longer. She prepared for it with the same thoroughness she brought to every deployment, methodically, completely, in the quiet hours before and after everything else that filled the operational day. She reviewed the terrain. She reviewed the approach corridors. She reviewed the environmental data and the target parameters and the equipment specifications and every other input the work required to be correct. She thought about Wren, briefly, on the night before departure. Not with sentiment, but with the specific acknowledgement of someone who knows the origin of the tools they are using and considers that origin worth a moment of honest recognition. She thought, this is the work. Then she went to sleep, because the work required sleep, and she treated the work's requirements with the same seriousness she brought to every other aspect of it. She was in the air by 0530. The cell at Fort Carson was cleaned and reassigned by 800 that morning. The cot was still bolted at the same height. The light behind the mesh was still the same quality of illumination. The window still looked at the concrete wall 4 feet away. The room did not know what it had held. Most rooms never do. There is a category of service that the public record cannot contain. Not because the people performing it are more important than the record, but because the record's existence would compromise the work. And the work is more important than the recognition. And the people doing it have understood this and accepted it and continued anyway, through the cells and the clearance gaps and the garrison officers who look up a name and find nothing and mistake the nothing for an answer. They are not looking for credit. They are not building toward a moment of revelation. They are doing the work in the rooms the work requires, in the dark and the cold and the administrative silence of a system that cannot publicly acknowledge them. And they are doing it with the same thoroughness they would bring to it if every room knew their name. The cell was 8 feet by 10 feet. The cot was too low. The light was behind mesh. She sat on the cot with her hands on her knees, and she breathed and she waited for the room to understand what it was holding. It took 3 hours and 21 minutes. Some things take longer. The work does not wait for the room to be ready. The work simply continues in whatever room the work is in until the room catches up or until the work is done and the next room begins. It is always one or the other. It is never anything else.